Welcome to 7.4. In this section, we're going to mostly be talking about the different terminology that's used when we talk about genetics, alleles, traits, all of that. Okay, so first up, we've got a gene. So a gene is a piece of DNA that directs a cell to make a certain protein. So because proteins are really the workhorses of the cell, they do really anything the cell needs them to. They can actually control your physical characteristics, your susceptibility to diseases, all these different kinds of things. So genes are incredibly important when we start talking through all of this and what the DNA means, what all the different pieces of DNA mean. So, like we talked about in the last section, the gene is basically for a certain trait. So in this case, it would be the seed form, if it's wrinkled or round. So the same gene can have many versions. We talked about this briefly at the end of the last section, where I said that they are different variations called alleles. So each gene also has what's known as a locus, basically location. Okay, it's a specific position on a pair of homologous chromosomes. So you have your two homologous chromosomes here. Remember, homologous just means that they have the same genes, okay? The same types of genes, not necessarily the same alleles. So we've got the same type of genetic information on both of them. And they have a locus on them, which is the specific position of a gene. Now, that it's not as precise as like a road map, okay? So you don't really have a road map to your chromosomes because it's not based solely on base pairs, okay? So like how many nucleotides are there from this end of the chromosome until you get to this gene, because that can actually change. So it's more of a kind of general order that the genes go in, and that's the locus. All right, so talking about alleles. So an allele is any alternative form of a gene, so the different variations that a gene can take, okay? So it's occurring at that specific locus on the chromosome for that gene. So it's a different flavor of the same gene. It can control like different colors of certain traits. It can determine if you have a widow's peak or not, all these different things. If you are going to have cystic fibrosis or not, different things like that. So there are two different classifications that we talk about with alleles, homozygous and heterozygous. So each parent donates one allele for every single gene, and that's because there is one allele for every gene on the set of 23 chromosomes that they donate to the next generation. Okay. So first up, we have our homozygous alleles. So homozygous alleles are the same, okay? So they are the same variation, the same flavor of that gene. Okay, so here we've got our homozygous alleles, and we have both of these alleles are for wrinkled seed pods or wrinkled seeds, okay? Now we also have heterozygous, okay? So heterozygous means that you have two different types of alleles. So in this example, we have one of these chromosomes, one of these alleles is for wrinkled seeds, and the other one is for round seeds, okay? Now, generally, if it's homozygous, it could be homozygous for wrinkled, like we see here, or it could be homozygous for round. So there is a distinction there that you have to make. So like this one would be, I would call it homozygous wrinkled, not just homozygous. Heterozygous because, and especially in this example, we only have two different options. You don't have to say heterozygous wrinkled round because there's not going to be any other option. It's always going to be one wrinkled, one round allele. Okay, so genes also influence the development of traits. There is some argument about nature versus nurture, your environment as you're growing up. Basically, the environment determines how well your genes get to influence the development of your traits. Okay, for example, if you had the genes to be, say, 6'2", okay, if that's what your genes said your max height could be, you would only reach that height if you had constant access to food, you didn't damage a growth plate growing up, all different kinds of things. But if you were growing up in a third world country where you didn't necessarily have access to food at all times, okay, your growth would be stunted. Right? So that's the environment having an influence on your traits as well. So it's not just the genes, but the genes play a huge factor in it. So all of an organism's genetic material combined is called a genome. Okay, so we talked about the Human Genome Project a while back. So that's why it was talking about the genome, because it's looking at all of an organism's DNA. So a genotype, okay, refers to the makeup of a specific set of genes, or gene, okay? So in this case, I gave you the example called the BRCA1 gene, okay? This is a gene that they've actually done a lot of research on recently because they found that it is actually linked to breast cancer. And so the phenotype is the physical expression of a trait. So that would be the susceptibility to develop breast cancer caused by this BRCA1 gene. Okay, the genotype could refer to the wrinkled seed, okay, and then, or the gene for that wrinkled seed, but then the phenotype is the physical expression of it, so it would actually be the wrinkled seed. Okay, so this is a little bit weird. You'll see this more as we get into it, where the genotype, we're generally going to write it with 2 letters. And then the phenotype is you have to say, this is what it would look like if you actually use these genes to create something. Okay. All right. So again, like I just said, alleles can be represented using letters. So you do have 2 different types of alleles. Okay. You have a dominant allele. So dominant alleles are expressed as a phenotype when at least one dominant allele is present. So basically, if there's a dominant allele present, the dominant phenotype is going to be expressed. Then you also have recessive alleles. So with recessive alleles, they will only be presented if there is no dominant allele to mask it. Okay, so basically, in order to have a recessive phenotype, you have to be homozygous for the recessive allele, or homozygous recessive. Okay, that would mean that you would have 2 copies of the recessive allele, so it would present as the phenotype because it's the only genetic information available to the cell. So dominant alleles are represented by uppercase letters, recessive are represented by lowercase. Okay, so dominant phenotype will be expressed if you are homozygous dominant, so you have 2 alleles for the dominant allele, or if you're heterozygous, so you have 1 dominant, 1 recessive. Recessive phenotypes will only be presented if the genotype is homozygous recessive. Okay, I think, no. All right, so let's get into an example here. So the round trait is dominant, and we're going to represent that with a capital R here. Okay, and then we have wrinkled, lowercase r, is recessive. Okay, so we see here on the top we have a heterozygous, we're heterozygous for this genotype. Okay, so we have 1 round allele and 1 wrinkled. Now, the wrinkled is recessive, the round is dominant. So that means that this seed is going to be round. Okay, so the genotype refers to the actual alleles present. So this would be capital R, lowercase r. Okay, so the genotype, let me write this out. The genotype would look like this if we were to write it out. Capital R, lowercase r. Okay. The phenotype is actually showing the round seed. Okay. All right, and then we move on to our, I don't know why I just got rid of my pen because I'm going to do it again here. Okay, so we would also get this phenotype here with the round seed if we had capital R, capital R. So that would be homozygous dominant, okay? So it's round if you have homozygous dominant or heterozygous in the genotype. And then down at the bottom here, we see our homozygous recessive. Okay, so you have two alleles for the wrinkled trait. Okay, the wrinkled allele. So the the genotype here is lowercase r, lowercase r. Okay, which is the only way that we can get the recessive phenotype to show up. So the round phenotype, again, could be expressed with a genotype of either capital R or capital R little r. The wrinkled can only be expressed with a genotype of little r, so homozygous recessive. So both homozygous dominant and heterozygous genotypes will yield a dominant phenotype, no matter what that is, okay? No matter what the gene is for. There is actually a genetic disease called Huntington's disease, which is basically going to result in death. Okay, it won't be a very pleasant way to go because it does take years, but Huntington's disease is actually a dominant trait. Okay, it doesn't express until a person is about 40 years old. So there are, well, oftentimes you'll see a person ends up with Huntington's and they didn't know it until they've already had kids of their own, and that's how the trait gets passed on. So if there is even one allele for that dominant Huntington's disease trait, then the person will have Huntington's disease later in life. Okay, now if you look at something like cystic fibrosis, that is actually a recessive trait. Okay, so you would have to have the two genes, the two alleles that are recessive at that point in order to get cystic fibrosis. Okay, so most traits actually occur in a range. They don't follow the simple dominant recessive trait, so instead they are controlled by multiple genes, and we'll get into that in the next chapter, the non-Mendelian genetics. Okay, so for right now we're just focusing on the simple either-or traits, where it's either the dominant trait or it's the recessive trait, okay, for each allele. All right, so that is it for this section.